Hi guys, today we're going to talk about friends. My wife was teasing me about this the other day. I was explaining all the topics that we've covered in the course. She says, okay, so earlier in the course you talked about numbers, you talked about colors, and now you're talking about friends. Are you teaching college or are you teaching kindergarten? My reply was, well, philosophy is just like kindergarten on steroids. The philosopher is the sort of person who never stopped asking why or what for or what is this. So today we are going to talk about friends. In particular, we're going to talk about Aristotle's account of friendship as it appears in his Nicomachean Ethics. So far we've seen that Aristotle thinks that there are a couple of key components or ingredients to the happy life based on his definition and based on what he's told us about some of those parts early on in the Nicomachean Ethics. We know that he thinks that in order to be happy, we have to be using our reason. We have to be living up to our full capacity as rational animals. And he thinks that this is also going to involve not only various virtues that help us to develop our mind and engaging in acts of intellect and acts of reason. He thinks we're also going to have to develop various aspects of our character. We're going to have various virtues. We're going to have to make ourselves into certain sorts of people in order to be happy. So far, some of the key ingredients of happiness, then, maybe the two most important ones that we've seen so far, are that you've got to be using your reason and developing your reason, and then you've got to be developing your character. You've got to be developing these sorts of moral virtues, which in book 2 he instructed us how to get, and then some in the middle books he gives us some particular guidelines for particular virtues that we should be aiming for. Even though it doesn't show up anywhere in his definition of happiness in section 7 of book 1, Aristotle clearly thinks that friendship has got to be an essential ingredient in your life if you want to be truly happy as a human being. Evidence for this is that Aristotle spends 2 whole books within the Nicomachean Ethics talking about friendship, books 8 and books 9. That's 2 out of 10. That's a large portion of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics that he focuses on friendship. That's an indication that this has got to be something that he takes very seriously, something that he thinks is really an essential component to happiness. He thinks that if you don't have friends, if you don't have true and meaningful, deep friendships, then you will not live a happy, fulfilling life. And he gives various reasons for this. What I want to talk about in this lecture are the 3 main topics that Aristotle covers with respect to friendships. He passes through all 3 of these things pretty early on in book 8, and then the rest of book 8 and 9 are sort of filling out more of the details. But I want to give you the gist. I want to talk about 3 things about friendship that Aristotle discusses. 1, he discusses various reasons for why we might think that friends are necessary for a good and meaningful and happy human life. Second, he gives a definition of friendship. What sort of relationships count as friendships? What would be required in order for something to count as a friendship? And then the most important part of his discussion is that he gives 3 different types of friendship. He says that there are 3 kinds of friendships that you can be in. One of them, he thinks, is better than the others, and so really you should be aiming for this one. Not that the others are bad, there's just one that's clearly better than the others. So that's what I want to walk you through in this lecture. Those 3 discussions. Why friends? What is friendship? And then the 3 types of friendship. So Aristotle lists several different reasons for why we might think that friends are essential for the happy life. He thinks that most practically, friends can offer us protection, or they're the sorts of people that can loan us things when we're in time of need. Friends can offer various aspects of emotional support in times of trouble. They can be a source of solace and encouragement. When things are going well, friends can help us celebrate and make us feel even better. He thinks that friends can take care of us when we're sick or when we're lonely. Friends can also serve a very important role in our moral development. They are the individuals on whom we can practice various virtues. Let's say, for example, you want to develop the virtue of patience. Patience can sometimes be very hard to develop, and it might be very hard to practice patience with people that you don't like. So one way to get started on this project is to practice it with people you do like, your friends. It's an easier way to get started in developing a virtue. So that's one thing that friends can do for us. Another thing that friends can do with respect to our moral development is that friends can hold us accountable. A good friend is not just someone who praises you and says nice things about you, but a good friend is someone who takes you aside and says, hey, that was a nasty thing that you said, you need to apologize. Or I don't really like the way that you've been behaving lately, or the things that you've been caught up in. I don't like what you're getting into right now. A good friend is someone who calls you out for that, someone who holds you accountable for various things and for various ways that you are. A friend loves you as you are, but also demands, right? Encourages you to become even better, or to at least stay as good as you are. So Aristotle lists several reasons for why we might need friends, why we should think that friends are essential to the happy life. If I were to teach this lecture in person, one of the things I start with is sort of a discussion on what we think friends do for us in our lives. So in place of that, I'm going to launch a discussion topic in which you're free to discuss either some of the reasons that Aristotle gives, maybe that I didn't mention, for why friends are important, why they're essential for the happy life. But I'm interested in your observations about what do you think is so important, what is the important role that your friends play in your life. As we're all sort of quarantined here in our own respective places, sort of separate from our friends for the moment. We can talk to them, right? We can maybe even video chat with them. But something about this is kind of sad, being separate from our friends for a while. And so one of the ways that you can consider this question is, what's missing right now? That you can't hang out with your friends, that you can't be with them, right? What is sort of the biggest thing missing in your life as a result of that? So anyway, that's the discussion topic. I would usually launch this lecture by discussing that as a class. Can't do it from a distance, so the best we can do maybe is to launch that discussion topic. So that's the topic of why would friends be necessary for the good life, for the happy life. Second question, what is friendship according to Aristotle? What sort of relationships count as friendships? Aristotle lists 3 conditions, and once again here I'm just working off of the notes that I put on the Canvas page, so you should be following along with those as well. It's going to make the most sense when you are. So what is friendship? Aristotle lists 3 conditions that a relationship would have to meet in order to count as friendship. Condition 1, you have to be willing the good of the other. In that sense, you have to be loving the other person, right? You will their good. You love them at least to that extent. Second condition, the other person has to also will your good. In other words, your goodwill towards that person has to be reciprocated. You can have goodwill towards all sorts of people who don't return it, but none of those relationships would count as friendships. Condition 3, which is kind of a curious one, he says that both parties, both individuals, both you and the other person, not only have to will each other's good, but you also have to be aware that each other person is willing the other's good. So the idea is that it can't be fully anonymous. So I think what he has in mind here is to block sort of a funny situation. It's something like, imagine it's your birthday and someone anonymously drops a present at your doorstep, and you open it up and it's like, wow, this is a great book, right? What a great present that someone has anonymously. I don't know who it was, but put it on my doorstep for my birthday. That's great. And then you think to yourself, oh wow, you know what? I know who would really love this book, so and so down the street. And so you package that book up maybe a couple weeks later, and maybe after you read it or something, and then you put it on that person's doorstep anonymously because you think that they'll enjoy the book. Unbeknownst to you, though, that person that you just dropped it off at whose home you just dropped it off was the same person who anonymously dropped it off at your doorstep. Sort of a weird situation, but if that was sort of all that was going on between you two, then it wouldn't quite count as a friendship, right? Not only you're willing each other's goods, but you're not aware that you're doing it. It is reciprocated, but there's not a degree of awareness that Aristotle thinks is necessary for it to be a friendship. So those 3 conditions. You got to will the good of the other. You got to love that person. The person's got to will your good. They got to love you back. And third, you both got to be aware that this is going on. That's what makes a friendship. That's, in some ways, it's kind of specific, but in other ways, it's also pretty general. That means, right, that you can be friends with your family members, right? You can be friends with your coworkers. You can be, it doesn't just include sort of the best friend scenario. It includes, it seems, a lot of relationships in our lives. Not all of them, but a bunch of them. Okay. Now, maybe the third most important part of Aristotle's account of friendship are the 3 types of friendship. This is one of my favorite parts of this section, and indeed one of my favorite parts of the Nicomachean Ethics. My thought is, if I could teach nothing else from the Nicomachean Ethics, this is the part that I would teach. So let's talk about the three kinds of friendship. He gives names for these. Each one counts as a kind of friendship, but each one is slightly different. So the first kind of friendship is a friendship of utility. In a friendship of utility, each person loves the other person, wills the other person's good, because the other person is useful to him or her. And once again, because it is a friendship, it does mean it's reciprocated, right? So that you will another person's good because you recognize that when they do well, you do well too. And they will your good because they recognize that when you do well, they do well as well. So examples of this sort of arrangement would be something like a business partnership. You've got, like, I don't know, CEOs of two different companies who reach an agreement and shake hands and will the good of the other company. Why? Because they've got this agreement such that when the other company does well, they do well in addition. Other examples of something like this, you might think that members of a band might form at least friendships of utility. The idea is, well, I really hope he rips it on that guitar solo. Why? You say you're the drummer or you're the keyboardist. Why? Because when he rips on that solo, right, the crowd gets really into it, and the crowd loves us all together as the band. And indeed, right, he hopes that you really nail that drum beat because when that happens, right, it really sets up his solo really well. So what you've got is a kind of friendship. Each one is willing the other's good, and they're both aware that they're doing it, but it's only because they recognize some use from the other person. They recognize some good in it for them, right, that the other person does well. That's a friendship of utility. The second kind of friendship is a friendship of pleasure. This is when each person loves the other or wills the good of the other because he or she is pleasant. It gives you the good feelings to be around that person, to be with that person. What each person recognizes in a friendship of pleasure is some sort of short-term benefit out of the relationship. And a friendship of utility is it's a bit more like more of a long-term benefit that they get from willing the good and being in the relationship with that person. A friendship of pleasure, it's more immediate. It's about the good feelings that they get from being around that other person. Examples of this arrangement, of this friendship, would be maybe someone you hang out with because he or she has a really great sense of humor, makes you laugh. And that person hangs around with you because you laugh at his or her jokes, makes him or her feel really good because you laugh at his or her jokes. So what you've got here is each person likes being around the other person and wills the other's good because, right, they get these good feelings out of being in that friendship with a person. You can imagine also a situation in which someone just maybe not about a sense of humor, but says really nice things. It's always saying things like, "Oh, well, your hair looks really nice today. Oh, well, that's a nice shirt." And sort of you return it, right? You like being around that person because they pick you up, they make you feel better, they say nice things, and in turn, you say nice things. You've got a good friendship going on there in terms of pleasure. You get the good feelings by being around that person. So that's a friendship of pleasure. So far, we talked about the friendship of utility and a friendship to pleasure. The third kind of friendship, though, is in many ways the most important one, and something radically different happens with this sort of friendship. This sort of friendship we can call a friendship of virtue or a friendship of the good because of what it's based on. A friendship of virtue is when each person loves the other, wills the good of the other because of his or her character, because of some qualities or virtues that the person recognizes and admires in the other person. Right? So why do you like that person? Why do you will that person's good? Well, because that person is kind and generous and patient and courageous. You would list out particular qualities, and indeed not just like accidental qualities like I like the way that person walks. No, you'd list some elements of that go deep into the person's character, right, are part of who they are. This is why you will their good, because you recognize good qualities in that person. And what happens here is that you recognize some virtuous qualities in the other person. And the reason that you will their good is because you admire and like those qualities about that person so much that you want to help to encourage that person to continue to be the sort of person that they are. You also see, right, you have this desire, I want there to be more people like this in the world. So you will the other person's good because you want them to stay as they are. You want to encourage them to keep all of the great qualities that make them who they are. But you also want there to be in the world more people like that. When you see something so impressive and so inspirational about the other person that you're just drawn to will their good. You love that person, you help that person because of the shining sort of qualities that you see in that person. Now, as I said, there's something very importantly different that happens at the level of the friendship of virtue. So friendship of utility, you will the other person's good because of some long-term benefit, some use you identify in the other person, and they will your good because of some use they identify in you. In a friendship of pleasure, you will the other person's good because of some good feeling that you get when you're around that person, and they do the same to you. But in a friendship of virtue, notice what happens here. It seems to be no longer about some long-term benefit that you get from the relationship. It also seems not to be about some good feelings you get when you are with the person. What happens at the stage of a friendship of virtue or the friendship of the good is something radically different. What happens is that you are no longer willing the good of the other person, loving the other person for what you can get out of that relationship. What happens in a friendship of the good or friendship of virtue is that it ceases to be about what you can get from the other person, and it becomes more about what you can give to that relationship. This is an important shift because it's no longer about you anymore. You have begun to love the other person, to will the other person's good for his or her own sake, not just for the sake of what you can get out of being with that person. And this is an important difference with the friendship of virtue or the friendship of good. And it sets us up for a discussion for why Aristotle thinks that a friendship of virtue, a friendship of good, is the best kind of friendship and why it's so crucially important, why this kind of friendship is a necessary component for the happy life, for the good life, for the fulfilling life. So we list a couple of reasons for why a friendship of virtue or a friendship of the good is the best kind and most complete kind of friendship. Well, the first thing is just what we said, is that what makes a friendship of virtue and friendship of good the best is because only in this kind of friendship are you willing the good of the other person, are you loving the other person for his or her own sake. All the other kinds of friendships are about what you get out of the relationship. Only a friendship of virtue or good is about what you can give to the relationship. That makes it seem to be a deeper, more meaningful relationship with the other person. All the other ones are, in a way, sort of selfish. They're not necessarily manipulative, because each of you are quite aware of what's going on here, but they do seem a bit self-centered. Only in the case of friendship of virtue or friendship of the good is it no longer about you. It's more about the good of the other person. There are a couple other things that Aristotle lists, a couple other reasons for why he thinks that this is the best kind of friendship. He says that the friendship of virtue, the friendship of the good, is the most stable. It is the most long-lasting. Why? Well, because think about what each kind of friendship is based on. Friendship utility is based on you being useful to the other person's being useful to you. So what happens when you are no longer useful to the other person is no longer useful to you, which is likely to happen. You identify some particular use that they serve for you, but they're not going to serve that use forever. And so what happens when either you are not useful to them or she or he is not useful to you? The friendship necessarily breaks down because that was the foundation of it. That's why you're in the relationship in the first place. So it's less stable. In a way, you're sort of constantly worrying about, why am I continuing to serve this use for the other person? How much can I rely on this relationship? Because what happens if I cease to be useful in this way? Then I can't count on getting the usefulness from this other person. So it's less stable. It's less reliable. How about a friendship of pleasure? A friendship of pleasure is based on the good feelings that you get when you're around that other person. Here's the thing about feelings. They don't often last. And like the person's jokes will, I don't know, maybe stop being as funny as they were before. You'll start to notice some things about the way in which the person compliments you as maybe potentially annoying. What happened in friendship of pleasure is that the good feelings that you get when you're around that person eventually will fade and wear out. And when they do, there goes the friendship, because that's the foundation of it. Once neither of you, or in fact, all it takes is just one. If either one of you no longer get the good feelings from being around with that other person, then the friendship collapses, because that's all that it's based on. Sadly, right, we see a lot of romantic relationships that are like this, that is just based on the feelings. And once the feelings are gone, they realize, wait a second, that was the foundation of relationships. Now that I don't get the feelings anymore, I have no further reason to be in a relationship with you. That's very sad. It means that those sorts of relationships are going to be unstable. They're not going to be reliable in the way that a friendship of virtue or good is. Well, what makes a friendship of virtue or friendship of good the most stable, the most reliable kind of friendship? Well, because it's based on these aspects of the person's character that run deep, that go deep into their character, deep into what make them the person that they are. And so these sorts of things are not just the temporary accidental things about the person. These run deep, and they're unlikely to change anytime soon. And so what the foundation of such a friendship is something that is indeed stable and long-lasting. These deep-seated character traits, these habits, these virtues that they have worked so hard to inculcate in themselves, to habituate in themselves. Remember what virtues are. Virtues are not just particular qualities. You have their particular qualities that you have habituated in yourself. And so if your friendship is based on those things, it's going to last as long as the virtues do. And based on what we know about the account of virtue that Aristotle gives in Book 2, virtues last. They're stable characteristics. They're stable dispositions that you have gotten through practice. And so if your friendship is based on those, it's going to be the most long-lasting, the most stable. Related to this is that the friendship of virtue, or the friendship of the good, is the most trustworthy. You can trust a friend of virtue or a friend of goodness in a more robust way than you can in the other forms of friendship. Why? Because, once again, the relationship is more stable. It's built on something more long-lasting. You can't maybe necessarily trust someone who's only in it because of how it makes them feel, because once the feeling's gone, they're not going to look out for your good anymore. Or when someone is just recognizing you as useful, when you no longer serve that purpose, they're not going to look out for your good anymore. It seems like those aren't the ones that you can trust in the long term. So far I identified a couple of key aspects for why friendship of virtue, or the friendship of good, is the best kind of friendship. It is the most stable and long-lasting. It is the most reliable. It is the one in which you can trust the other person in the most deepest way. It is the only one in which you are willing the good of the other person for his or her own sake, and not for something that you get out of the relationship. The last thing that Aristotle cites in favor of the friendship of virtue being the best kind of friendship is that in a friendship of the good, or friendship of virtue, you get, if you're really in a friendship of virtue or the good, you get all of the benefits of the other kind of friendship. Think of it this way. Someone who is really virtuous, aren't they also likely to be very useful? Yes. Someone who is very virtuous, is kind, is patient, is courageous, is generous, aren't they also very likely to be pleasant to be around? Yes. And so if you're in a friendship of virtue, then you get, right, the usefulness of the other person, and you get the pleasant feeling of being around them. But here's the kicker, right? And here's the interesting thing about a friendship of virtue, a friendship of good. It's a kind of paradox, one of my favorite philosophical paradoxes. The idea is that you can get all of the benefits, and you get the best benefits from a friendship of virtue, better than the benefits of any of the other kinds of friendship. But here's the kicker. Here's the paradox. Notice that the only way to be in a friendship of virtue is when you are willing the other person's good for his or her own sake. As I said, a friendship of virtue is when you've gotten to the point where it's no longer about what you can get out of the relationship, but what you can give. And so the paradox is this, right? That in order to get all of the benefits from the deepest kind of friendship, you have to cease caring about the benefits. In order for you to get the most out of a friendship, you have to no longer care what you're getting out of it. Because if you still are are interested, if you still have your eye on what all sorts of goods that your friend does for you, then you're not yet in a friendship of virtue or friendship of the good. You're in one of the other ones. You're in a friendship of utility or a friendship of pleasure. It's only when you cease to focus on, when you no longer care about the goods that are in it for you, that you're in a friendship of virtue. And only then do you get the best goods that are in it for you. Right? That's the paradoxical thing. The only way to get the best goods for yourself is to cease caring about those goods for yourself. And indeed, the paradox gets even bigger, right? Because when Aristotle says that friendship is necessary, is essential for living a happy, complete, meaningful human life, he's not just talking about friendship of utility and friendship of pleasure. Those are important kinds of friendship, he thinks, and we should have all sorts of friendships that fit those conditions. But he also thinks that you should have at least a few friendships of virtue or friendships of good. And he says that they're going to be rare. They're going to be so demanding that you can probably only have like 3 or 4, maybe in your lifetime, really, uh, uh, really robust, strong friendships of virtue or friendships of the good. So he thinks that necessary component of happiness is friendship, and not just any kind of friendship, a friendship of virtue. And so in order to be happy, you have to have various friendships of virtue. Now, here's the paradox at another level, right? So if it's right that the only way to be truly happy is to have these sorts of friendship, but no, the only way to get these kinds of friendship is to no longer care about what is in it for you, here's the sort of happiness paradox that his account of friendship introduces. The only way to be fully happy, to be completely happy, to be happy at the deepest level, is to no longer care about your own happiness. That's what his account of friendship says. Because it means that if you are thinking about how this will contribute to your own happiness, then you're not in a friendship of virtue, and you will not achieve that kind of happiness of which you are capable. And so I think this is a really interesting sort of paradox. The only way to get the best benefits out of a friendship of virtue is to cease to care about what's in it for you. And the only way to achieve full happiness, to be happy in the fullest sense, in the fullest way that human beings are capable of, is to, at important moments and in various aspects of your life, to no longer care about your own happiness and to care more about the happiness of other people. That's kind of an interesting paradox, and it's one of my favorite parts of the Nicomachean Ethics. So whereas in other parts of the Nicomachean Ethics, you think, well, wait a second, the whole purpose of life is to focus on your happiness and to develop your virtue and to develop your reason. That sounds a bit self-centered, Aristotle. But I think once we look at his account of friendship, we see that it isn't just a self-centered ethics. It isn't just a self-centered map for how to live a good life. In order to live a good life, in order to live a happy life, you have to cease thinking about, caring about your own happiness. That's what his account of friendship teaches us. I think that's a really important lesson, and I think it wards off an apparent worry about Aristotle's account. So that's his account of friendship. I think that it asks some very important questions of us and of our lives. Principally, I think that what we ought to think about, and something that I'd like you to think about, I think is very important for you to think about, is if friendships of virtue are really essential and necessary for living a happy life. Do I have any of those? Am I missing this key component for the happy life? So how do you know? How do you know? You probably have a bunch of different friends, right? But how do you know which of those friendships actually count as friendship of virtue or friendship of good? Here's the test, I think. Think about your friendships, your particular friendships, and think about, right, the love that you have for the other person, the way that you will the good of the other person. Now think of that relationship and think about what would happen if that person ceased to be useful to you. And indeed, what if that person started to become a burden? They started to be burdensome. They're no longer not even useful, right? They sort of got in the way of maybe some of your practical goals. Would you still love that person? Would you still will their good? If not, then you don't have a friendship of virtue, a friendship of good. But if yes, then maybe you have something there. And think about a friendship. Think about your particular relationships again, and think about, well, yes, I like being around that person. They make me feel good. But think about, what if that stopped? What if you no longer got pleasant feelings when being around that person? What if they were no longer pleasant to be around, but they were kind of a grump? That kind of, in some ways, made you feel worse to be around them. Would you still love them? Would you still will their good? If not, then you don't have a friendship of virtue or a friendship of the good. But if yes, if your answer is yes, in any of your relationships, if you can honestly and sincerely say that if that person ceased to be useful, if they became a burden, and if they ceased to be pleasant, if they became sort of unpleasant, if they became grumpy, and sometimes they made you sort of, in a way, uncomfortable, or they didn't make you feel good to be around. If you can say that even in those cases, you would still love that person, you would still truly will the other person's good for his or her own sake, that's when you know you have a friendship of virtue, a friendship of the good. And that's when you know that you have one of the key ingredients for living a happy life. If none of your friendships pass that test, then you have to start wondering about, well, maybe that's one of the reasons for why I'm not as happy as I could be. Maybe that's the missing element. Maybe I need to work on not only developing my mind through reason, not only developing my character through virtue, maybe I need to start working on my relationships. Maybe I need to grow not only in wisdom and virtue, but also love. And I think that's an important lesson that Aristotle teaches us in his account of friendship. Next time, we'll get into a discussion of his account of the role of pleasure in a happy life, and the one after that, we'll talk about his account of what is the best sort of life that human beings can live, because we haven't gotten this full answer to that question yet. And so we'll look at these two discussions from Book 10. Thanks very much.